As the wise Shoppers Drug Mart manager I met on Grindr when I was 17 once told me, it's not about length, it's about girth. What he meant by this specifically is a mystery, given that he didn't really bring either to the table, but that's beside the point. The fact of the matter is that, in almost all instances, length isn't the best indicator of a quality experience, and that very much so applies to video games too. Over the years, there's been a slow but steady shift in how we view games and evaluate their quality, with how many hours of enjoyment per dollar spent on it can I get out of it, becoming increasingly common as a way to evaluate a piece of media's value. And I've definitely done this myself too, especially before I started streaming. I'd been unemployed or underemployed for most of my adult life until last year, and even as a kid, I didn't tend to get a ton of video games, so an hours per dollar calculation makes sense to me. It's not like I ever went without or anything. I want to be clear there. I was pretty lucky, all things considered. I was just the type to spend a million hours playing the same game rather than playing a million different things for an hour. But when you think about it, that's kind of a really weird way to evaluate media that we're consuming. We don't tend to do the same sort of thing with movies or TV shows or music or really anything else except maybe books and board games. Part of this is just that a lot of media has a pretty standardized runtime. Movies are almost always between 80 and 120 minutes, with 90 to 100 usually being the sweet spot and anything over like 150 being considered outrageously long. TV shows typically have runtimes that go up in roughly 22-minute increments as a result of television programming going in 30-minute blocks and needing to leave room for some ads, and even for shows that exclusively exist on streaming platforms, that still tends to hold. The average modern song in most genres will run about 3.5 minutes, give or take, although it can swing as low as 2 minutes if you're Pink Pantheress, and as long as 10 minutes if you're really confident you have an audience with an attention span that can stick around that long. But even with books, where I think you tend to see a bit more of this approach, it's still usually not like a hard and fast rule because almost nobody tracks their time spent reading a specific book down to the minute or even hour. Video games as a medium function differently than most. For one, again, as we've gone over many times on this channel, they're interactive. And that means that we need to be able to extract enjoyment out of the experience rather than passively watching it produce enjoyment. For another, it's a really pricey medium. Video game prices are creeping closer and closer to $100 US for bigger releases, and even the relatively cheap indie games still frequently cost more than paying for a movie ticket or a TV show on a streaming platform, or a book that isn't a brand new release. For a third, it also requires very expensive hardware to boot. Either a PC that's probably running you well over $2,000 right now thanks to how bad AI has fucked the market for hardware, or a console that still costs several $100s and isn't really useful for much beyond playing the games that are made to be compatible with it. For a fourth, it's a medium that has basically zero standardization. The only real standard for runtime is that it needs to be at least a couple hours, since if it's shorter than that, someone can beat it and then still get a refund on most platforms like Steam. But there's not really an upper limit. They can stretch on forever. The problem here is that this isn't inherently a good thing. A lot of the last couple decades of gaming has emphasized the amount of time you can sink into a game, whether it's through a billion side quests or collectibles or just a very long story, but it is a mistake for us to view how many dozens of hours could you theoretically spend on doing every single thing in this game as being synonymous with the question, is this a good game? The need to extract our own entertainment from it, the need to justify paying the price up front, and the need to feel like we got our money's worth out of it at the end are all, in tandem, liable to make us conflate length and quality. And in this video, I want to get into why that's wrong. A long game isn't inherently a good game. But in the interest of not being too hypocritical here regarding, going a bit longer than we need to, we should probably just get right into it. Part 1. Why are video games so long? The short answer to this question is that it comes down to the immaturity of the medium. Storytellers who use the medium of video games are operating under both permissions and restrictions that have never existed for any other storytellers in history, and that makes it hard to determine how best to tell a story in it. However, I think that kind of oversimplifies things, and you deserve more of an answer than that. For the infancy period of literally every other artistic medium as a modern commercial product, there were always some pretty hard limits put on the runtime of any given piece as a result of the series of overlapping zero-sum games that were happening. Take television, for example. Television originated as a publicly presented medium in the sense that the TV viewing experience was dictated by a presentation that was shared among all members of the public who wanted to watch, rather than being individualized like it is now with modern streaming. This meant that you had to standardize a TV schedule so people knew what would be on and when. And that meant standardizing what a programming block could look like. This ended up being 30-minute blocks that would be dedicated to a single program on a single channel. But TV, like a lot of media, relies on being subsidized by advertising. So that meant that typically about 6 to 8 minutes of each block was set aside for advertisers. So to oversimplify a little bit, a TV show can be 22 minutes or 44 minutes or 66 minutes or some other multiple of 22. Usually not much longer than that though, just because at that point you're just making a series of movies. The reason this is a zero-sum game is because every minute of runtime given to a program within its programming block is a minute of time that can't be used to generate revenue from ads. No party can gain without the other losing the equivalent. What's more, every program on the channel is in a zero-sum game with every other program over the 48 programming blocks in a day. Every block given to one show is one that can't be given to another. So if you're making a show that's going to take 2 programming blocks instead of just 1, you are doing so at the direct expense of every other show. What's more, not all programming blocks are equally valuable. 2 p.m. on a Tuesday is not as valuable as a Thursday at 6 p.m. TV shows had to build in time for ad breaks, for catching the audience back up on the last week's episode, and for making sure there was room for a full arc within the episode, the season, and the series. And the thing is, this obviously isn't still the case. I mean, it is for anything on cable, but who fucking watches cable? We don't restrict television as a medium to cable or satellite TV even. Television as a medium no longer operates around the same incentives in the streaming era. But crucially, TV shows are still largely structured based on how they were molded in their infancy. Most media is like this, again, especially as a commercial product. Just because ebooks are a thing today doesn't eliminate a lot of the structural elements of the medium of novels that existed as a result of publishing houses or physical print media, shipping logistics, stuff like that. Movies like TV theoretically are liberated from the restraints that existed around their runtime in their early days thanks to streaming, but those restraints became so encoded into the medium that they persist beyond their explicit necessity, and movies that are meant for theatrical releases still have to be of a length that works for theaters. Not too long, or there's no time to turn the theater over between showings or run as many showings as you could, but not too short or people will feel like it wasn't worth the time. Modern music used to average around a 3.5-minute runtime per song because while it wasn't as strict as it was with television, there was still that zero-sum game between the songs as well as between songs and advertising on the radio. However, in the streaming era, we've seen that start to creep lower and lower because artists get paid per stream so long as they listen more than 30 seconds, which creates the incentive to put out shorter songs and more of them. After all, if you're getting paid the same whether the song is 2 minutes or 10 minutes, then why not put out a 2-minute song that someone might listen to 5 times in that same span of time? Not every artist does this, to be clear, and I don't think that all of them are doing it cynically. Sometimes they just want to make a shorter song, whatever. And a lot of the time people do complain about the songs being too short, but even then, it's not like they're treating length as a stand-in for quality. At least not in the same sort of way. They're just criticizing a song for being too short for what it's trying to do. And it's not like a 10-minute song would be treated as inherently better purely on the grounds of being a longer song either. Arguably kind of the opposite. Plus, even with songs getting shorter, we're talking about like 95% of pop music still being within 2 to 4 minutes of runtime, and only a tiny sliver of the leftovers from that will ever drop below 90 seconds or above 5 minutes. Public presentation was a huge factor in all of this, obviously. Even though most of this media can be consumed privately nowadays, the medium structures were defined by their limitations in a way that becomes really, really hard to separate from them even after the restraints are lifted. It's like growing a watermelon in a square jar. After a certain point, that watermelon is a cube, and that's just how it's going to be, even if you remove it from the jar. However, even media like novels had to work around the zero-sum realities of having to share shelf space with other books, or needing to be able to maximize the number of copies that could be shipped out in a single box, and stuff like that. Video games, by contrast, never really existed as a narrative medium with a public presentation component. Even arcades, which are about as close as you can get with gaming, are still ultimately consumed on your own schedule. There were still zero-sum games going on, only so much room for cabinets, only so much computing power in those cabinets, etc., but they were very different right from the jump, especially because arcades weren't really for narrative-focused games. You could have them, but they needed to be short, accessible, and digestible for someone whose ability to experience the narrative is directly related to how many quarters they have and how good they are at it. And as far as length goes, the incentive was to keep play sessions as short as possible per quarter spent so you could maximize revenues. Every second where the player is watching a cutscene or reading dialogue is a second where they are not at risk of dying. And if they aren't at risk of dying, then they aren't at risk of needing to give you more money. As a result, the incentive was to keep the storytelling components of your game lean so they didn't get in the way of the gameplay or the quarters per hour calculations that arcade owners would have to keep in mind. As a narrative medium, video games have always been a fundamentally private one. You are responsible for acquiring consumer-level hardware that can run the games. You are responsible for buying the games personally, individually, no public presentation involved. And you are responsible for allocating the time to experience it. There are way fewer zero-sum games involved when it comes to this medium and runtime. A game's length had no effect on the cost of shipping, unless you needed like a second disc or something like that. Same with the amount of shelf space it would take up, or the amount of runtime it would have to share with advertisers, or really anything else outside of some very fringe edge cases. And what's more, video games were still in their infancy as a medium when the internet developed. And as consumer level hardware power increased, and consumer level digital storage increased, and consumer level access to the internet increased, especially high speed internet, the few limitations that did exist to restrict the game's runtime were just being whittled away more and more. At this point, there's really no limit. In theory, virtually all games can be played indefinitely because they don't have a hard and fast runtime at all, but even in practice, there's really no definitive runtime for any of them. Some games have a runtime that's heavily dependent on how good you are at it. Others have a runtime that's just heavily dependent on how many side stories you allow yourself to get distracted by. Still others have a runtime that's decided on a player-by-player basis depending on the choices you make in your own playthrough. What's more, video games have kind of a weird production structure compared to most other media as a result of how digital assets work. For most media, the runtime has a fairly direct relationship to the amount of time it'll take to produce. If you want to produce another episode or another song or another movie, it's fairly predictable and linear in terms of how long that'll take. Video games, by contrast, typically are really heavily front-loaded in terms of the production process. A ton of time and effort is required just to get all the assets and systems and everything functional. But once all the pieces are there, it's relatively easy to dramatically increase the runtime without needing to produce a ton more stuff. Like, let's take Persona 5 as an example, and specifically use the coffee shop. That coffee shop level needs to be used at least one time in-game, so all that work has to go into modeling and programming and designing that space for the one time it has to be used. And that'll take a lot more time, relatively speaking, than, let's say, filming an episode of a TV show in a coffee shop. However, let's say that you want to have a second day that takes place in that coffee shop. Well, it's already built in the video game. All you need to do is just reuse it. Maybe add some new character placements or move some people around or whatever, but you don't need to pay to rent the space for a second day or pay actors to show up the second day the same way you would for a TV show. Nor do you need to set up the entire set again from scratch. You can just keep using those assets. For a long time, video games did this because it was necessary to save space on pretty limited hardware. That's why so many NPCs are carbon copies of one another, especially in older games. However, it also allows for dramatically expediting the production of a game. Once the assets are built, it's much easier for a video game to use them to extend the runtime than basically any other medium. The cost-benefit analysis of making Persona 5 last an extra double-digit number of hours with Royale looks a lot better than filming an extra dozen or so episodes of a TV show. And again, Persona doesn't have to run into those sorts of zero-sum games. It's not fighting for shelf space in a physical store. It's not fighting to fit as many copies into a shipping container as possible. It's not fighting for one of 48 programming blocks on the channel. It's not fighting for one of the handful of theaters that can show it for a set number of showings each night. None of that. It is still in competition with other games, need to be clear about that, but crucially, it's not in a zero-sum scenario. What's more, video games are a relatively very expensive medium in terms of the cost to the average consumer, more than basically any other. You have to find a way to make it worth it to the consumer to spend that much money on hardware and software. Frequently like a 4-digit sum by the time it's all said and done. And highlighting how many hours of enjoyment a consumer can get out of it is a really straightforward metric to try and do that. The problem there is that it leads to the assumption that there is a correlation between value, quality, and runtime that just doesn't exist. And that's the next point to touch on. Part 2. Why isn't there a correlation? In the early days of video games, storage space and hardware limitations meant that games were ultimately a combination of very difficult and very short most of the time, especially since the medium was still largely defined by the conventions of the arcade even as those games started getting ported to home consoles. Arcade games were built to separate children and adults, but especially children, from their quarters, so the ideal games had simple stories that could hook you quickly attached to mechanics that'll kill you a lot so you have to keep paying to get ahead. With console games, the incentives changed, but their effects really didn't, at least not for a little bit. Instead of trying to extract quarters, now you're trying to make people feel like the game will be worth what they spend. And how do you make sure that people feel like the game will be worth the price? Well, you make sure they get enough hours out of it, same as today. The difference was back then you couldn't get those extra hours by just adding in more fluff to the game. There was not the space on the cartridge or in the console storage or in the cloud for the game to get longer or to add more depth to it a lot of the time. So instead, you had to find ways to make it take longer to get through whatever you could fit on it. Back in the very early days, that just meant scaling up the difficulty. Make enemies hit harder, move faster, and take more hits so that players were less likely to be able to rush through it. If you've ever played a fighting game that was built for the arcade era, you've experienced this for yourself. Like, I remember playing Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 for iOS as a kid, which uses basically the same scaling as in the arcade era. And like at a certain point, the opponents just beat you to death mercilessly, and there's not really much you can do about it. It was kind of necessary to stretch out games this way because there literally just wasn't enough spare room in the early days to have a ton of dialogue or whatever. You know, you couldn't really ask players to go lose themselves in the wilderness or whatever either because there wasn't room for a wilderness. And in a lot of ways, this actually helped games innovate. A famous example is the Metal Gear Solid franchise, which initially was supposed to be more of a straightforward shooter, but the game couldn't handle having so many elements on the screen at once, so instead it became a stealth game since that required a lot less action on screen. Restrictions can force people to try and solve a problem in a unique way, and that can be a big factor in evolving a medium. You know, same goes for the era of sitcoms being exclusively available on cable, which forced them to keep the writing a lot tighter to fit into their blocks. Whereas on streaming services, they tend to meander more because those restrictions aren't as strict. However, this get the most bang for your buck mentality when it comes to games wasn't constrained to that era where you had to stretch your quarters in the arcade, or, get a Christmas present that could last you longer than the holidays. As storage capacity expanded dramatically and as consumer hardware in terms of both PCs and consoles became more powerful, the incentives expanded a bit. Graphics were a factor that became increasingly relevant over time. Each new console generation for a while involved a massive leap forward in graphics, and so as generations progressed, the prominence of graphics became a bigger and bigger factor determining if a game is worth it, because it just looked objectively better than what you'd previously spent $60 on, so it must be worth the upgrade. However, in recent generations, that's just been kind of less of a factor. Graphics still continue improving, don't get me wrong, but the difference between the 9th and 10th console generations doesn't really hold a candle to the leap from the 3rd to the 4th, or the 4th to the 5th. People still want the graphics to look like it's worth it, but when it's being evaluated in terms of that bang for your buck metric, a game you paid $80 for 5 years ago probably doesn't look that far off from a game you might pay $80 for today. $80 Canadian, just to make it clear. The 2010s were kind of where this sort of thing peaked, though, because at that point, it just sort of became normal for a game to look very graphically impressive on a technical level. Like, okay, sure, we can see every pore on Nathan Drake's face, but we've seen that sort of level of detail before. It's existed for a few years at this point, it doesn't differentiate itself that much. It's not as useful for publishers when it comes to selling a game. What has remained a strong incentive, though, is still playtime. How many hours can you get out of this game? While that metric used to be stretched by making it harder to progress through the game, that sort of thing becomes more complicated as games themselves become more complicated. Instead of just making the story last longer by shooting the player in the face a bunch of times, you could extend it by establishing more of a story and finding ways to squeeze every last drop out of each asset you used. For a while, I think it's pretty safe to say that this was hit or miss. A lot of the early famous franchises in the medium were buoyed by extremely simple, straightforward stories, whether that was like Wolfenstein or Mortal Kombat. And not all of them had a graceful transition into an era where they kind of needed to have a real story. They figured it out eventually, but not all of them had a graceful teenage era. Part of this is that publishers and studios had a pretty narrow understanding of their target demographic. Namely, a frankly kind of patronizing view of teenage boys who just want cool dudes who don't look at explosions and hot chicks in skimpy outfits. But part of it is also just that it was a very young medium taking its first steps into storytelling, and it was of course going to have some misses. As mentioned earlier, video games are a medium with a unique set of constraints that don't really carry over super clearly from other narrative media, and that means having to figure out a whole new set of fundamentals. And we can see writers struggle with this sort of thing with stuff like QTEs, a way to simultaneously give the player a sense of agency in a crucial scene while also making it as easy as possible so player skill can't really get in the way of the story you're telling. As the medium has started to mature, it's involved telling more narratively and emotionally complex stories, but it's hard to tell a story coherently and hit your story beats at the exact right moment when the protagonist isn't on script. So QTEs have been a good way to avoid just showering the player with cutscenes that they don't feel invested in and make them feel like they're still part of it without breaking up the flow. At least in theory. In practice, we got press F to pay respects. A meme from Call of Duty that at this point is so old that a fair bit of my audience probably doesn't actually know the original cutscene. F has become almost entirely divorced from the original scene where you were meant to be paying your respects at a fellow soldier's casket. Now it's just like, F, that sucks. Like, sorry you lost. What's more, there's never really been a medium that allows for audience agency, at least not on this scale, which means that world building takes on whole new implications and importance in a way it never could in any other medium. The Elder Scrolls games contain a ton of books you can pick up and read at your leisure throughout the open world, and that's something that can't exist in a movie or TV show or a novel because you don't get the agency to decide whether or not to read the Avengers equivalent of the lusty Argonian maid or whatever in an MCU movie. Narrative storytelling in a lot of games, especially open world games, is built on a foundation of world building that is at least to some degree only explored at the player's discretion. Again, open world games are obviously the biggest examples of this, but plenty of linear games also have optional content that you can find basically by accident or by stumbling upon it, like audio logs in a game like BioShock or Halo ODST. I mean, ODST is kind of open world, but you get my point. However, open worlds bring us to the first major reason why there isn't a correlation between a game's runtime and its quality. Namely, that quality is typically an evaluation of a piece of media's depth, not its length or its width. To my mind, most media is only really evaluated on the metrics of length and depth, with length being the actual length of the media and the depth being how much there actually is to it. Is it 1,000 pages of nonsense, or is it 100 pages of dense thriller action? Width as a metric is more like the scope of things that the audience can experience within the media property as a whole in terms of its narrative and canon. Like the MCU as an entity has some width kinda because its media properties overlap and exist simultaneously sometimes, so the audience can be exploring multiple perspectives of characters and their relationships with each other and the overarching narrative, but most media just exists as itself, with a single linear way to experience its story. You can do media interpretation of that story, but the fundamental story is the same. Video games, by contrast, can get very wide. Open worlds in particular allow for the width of a game to expand exponentially by allowing the player to explore at their own pace and in their own order, which can mean a theoretically infinite amount of potential playtime. The problem, however, is that that doesn't inherently mean it's quality playtime. Open world games have a frequent flaw of being as wide as the ocean but deep as a puddle, with huge maps with very little to actually do in them that's worth doing. Some games get this right, to be clear. Skyrim does it pretty well, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, there are lots of good open world games, but especially in the 2010s, we got a lot of games that should have just been linear experiences where the narrative could be tailored and specific, instead of just allowing players to meander and filling the game with worthless nonsense that didn't contribute to the experience or give them something worth exploring just to try and extend that runtime. And this is the thing, a game can be made technically very long by allowing the player to just infinitely wander, which means that publishers and studios can advertise that you can spend hundreds of hours in the game without exploring every last nook and cranny. But that doesn't inherently mean that there's something worth exploring in every nook and cranny just because it's there. There are a lot of open world games that are worse as narratives and as interactive experiences because they fixated on length and width but not depth, and which would have been a lot better if they were much shorter, more focused stories that dove deep. But that's also not the only way to extend things. Sure, you can give the player infinite space to get lost in, but linear games can also get stupidly long too. And even if you use length rather than width to increase the runtime, that still doesn't mean that depth is what's being improved. Linear games come with the obstacle of typically not being able to spend infinite hours actually doing stuff, because at least in theory, the game is always marching towards the finish line when you're engaging with it. But that doesn't mean you can't make a stupidly long game. And this is where it starts to get tricky, because the key part of the title of this video, a long game isn't inherently a good game, is that word in the middle, inherently. The whole point here isn't to argue that there is a negative correlation between length and quality, because that would be silly. A long game can be good or bad, just like a short game can be. The point of the video is to argue that there also isn't a positive correlation between length and quality, that length and quality are two totally separate markers that do not relate to one another, at least not directly. The reason I bring this up is that the whole wide is the ocean deep as a puddle critique primarily applies to games that allow you to widen the scope of your experience at your own discretion. Open world games where you could just wander off and do some bullshit for 100 hours if you wanted that nobody else is obligated or even expected to do. And this is kind of a you control the buttons you press moment. Yeah, you can make Skyrim a terrible 1,000-hour experience if you're bad at deciding what you want to do and controlling your own experience, but is that really the fault of Skyrim or Bethesda for not stopping you from ruining your own fun? If you have free time and choose to spend it hitting your head against the wall, it's not like it's really anyone else's fault that you have a headache, and I think most people are pretty much on the same page here. That doesn't mean you can't critique a bloated open world game, because you absolutely can, but just that those games in particular allow you to kind of ruin your own experience by drawing out the runtime in a way that ultimately isn't really anyone's fault but your own. But the linear stories are the more important ones to talk about here, because I think consumers at this point understand that when an open world game says there's 1,000 hours worth of stuff to do, then that doesn't literally mean you have to sink 1,000 hours in to experience it fully. Narrative-heavy linear games, by contrast, are a very different dynamic. Games like Persona 5, or Inescapable, or The 100 Line, or Ace Attorney, or whatever else, where the length of the game is still a bit up to the player, but where it's a specific measurement of the distance between the start of the experience and the point at which you've experienced the story enough to feel complete. You can still have a pretty complete understanding of Skyrim as an experience, even if you didn't complete the main quest line, or if you didn't do any of the side quests. But if you don't beat Persona 5, at least the baseline portion of it, excluding Royale, you aren't really finished with that experience, even if you did sink 100 hours into it. And it's with games like Persona 5 that length seems like an indicator of quality in some sense. of being worth it, that you're spending all that money and will get a long, winding, complex story out of it. The dollars per hour ratio there is pretty solid. The problem there is that obviously not every long game is worth it. Inescapable is long as fuck and terrible from start to finish. The length actively makes the experience worse even, because it just never fucking ends. And even with a good story, there's a risk of dragging it out too much or overstaying your welcome if it goes on for too long. A lot of stories aren't long because it's necessary for the story to be good, but because of, for lack of a gentler term, a failure in writing and editing. Inescapable is a terribly written game that doesn't have the slightest concept of pacing, and in that sense it's firmly on the writers and editors. However, you also have games like Zero Escape, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, where the game itself is good, and I'll stand by that, but where it also really suffers from a lack of an editor who could wrangle the story into something a bit more coherent at points. We don't need to streamline all of the fluff out of the game, but there's a lot of reading Wikipedia articles at you in 999. Process of Elimination is a game that I liked. It was a pretty good game that suffers from not knowing how to pace its story or edit it to make its themes more coherent. And even when you like a game, there is a very fine line between getting more bang for your buck and feeling like your time is being wasted. But again, there's not an inherently negative correlation here either. Persona games are very long, but it's because they're trying to tell a lot of story, and they generally use the time pretty well. The 100-line Last Defense Academy is the best game I think I've ever played, and it is also one of the longest ones ever made. But it still generally uses its time well and spreads its narrative out enough to get real value out of the moment and keep the quality high. And the tricky part of this is that I think the length of both of those examples is actually kind of part of what contributes to making them enjoyable. There's so much story to get lost in that it makes it feel immersive and engaging and builds anticipation and excitement in a way that it couldn't do if it wasn't as long. It's one thing to conceptually understand that a story takes place over the span of several months, but it's another to really feel those days dragging on, to experience the passage of time alongside the characters in a way that makes it feel a lot more earned when you, like the characters, finally defeat the villain after all that time spent building up to it. This is something that happens in all media, even arguably in my own video essays. A lot of my videos pose a question that could, at least in theory, probably be answered within a single paragraph. But it's not just about answering the question, it's about exploring how that question comes to be answered in order to more thoroughly understand and enjoy the topic. However, the experience that comes with video games and time passing is something that no other medium can truly replicate. And for stories like Persona or The 100 Line, I think we would lose a lot of their magic if they were only experienced as something like a movie or a TV show or even a novel. That's why the inherently part of the title is what's important. The length isn't inherently a good thing, but in some of these examples, it's being used really well. It's also not an inherently bad thing. It's just being used poorly in the case of games like Inescapable. Likewise, there are tons of short games that are really good. The Crush House is a really fun short little game where you play as a cameraman for a reality show called The Crush House, and you're responsible for picking which 4 cast members will join that season and then making sure to film the stuff the audience wants to see. A game like Deathloop can be long, but even if you finish it quickly, it's still a really enjoyable experience. And it's not improved by failing to get the loop closed faster. And of course, this also brings in the subjectivity inherent to the discussion. We all understand that good and bad are inherently subjective, I hope, but so are long and short. What is a long runtime for a game? The 100 Line is pretty unquestionably a long game by any metric that would allow us to qualify any game as a long one, but how many hours does a normal playthrough have to take before it's considered long? Is 30 hours a long game? 40, 50, 60, 80, 100? Do we only count the main story, or are we also counting side missions here? Is 20 hours a short game? What about 10? What about 15? Even if you think you have strict parameters for this sort of thing, you might not be as right as you think you are. There's a funny joke that was going around from the Peak developers a little while back where they talked about the pricing of their game at $8 that goes, in a player's mind, what does it mean to spend $5? Well, that's $5. But $6? Well, that's still $5. $4 is also kind of $5 though. $3 is $2, and $2 is basically free. So we've got these tiers now. $12, that's $10. But $13 is $15. And we found that $8 is still $5. It doesn't become $10. $7.99, that's $5, right? So $8 going to $5 is the biggest differential we could find in pricing, so we found it very optimal. We can do that same sort of joke and make it about length. Anything under 5 hours basically doesn't exist. 7 hours is 5 hours, but 8 hours is 10 hours. 35 hours is basically 40 hours, and we don't do decimal points here, so 12 hours and 30 minutes needs to either become 12 hours, which is 10, or 13 hours, which is 15. 20 hours or less is a short game probably, unless it's an open world one, in which case you could just say the game is like actually infinite hours long and nobody takes it seriously. Anything over 60 hours is usually kind of 60 hours, and anything between 50 and 60 gets bumped up to 60 if it's before DLC, otherwise it's 50. Anything below 0 and 20 hours is a short game. Anything between 20 and 40 is long for an indie but short for AAA. Anything between 40 and 60 is probably a long game, but it depends on how much of it is optional, and anything over 60 hours is a long game by default. And see, the fun thing about this is that it actually pretty neatly correlates with pricing for games in the US for the game studios. And by fun, I mean that actually really exacerbates this. And that's for the next section. Part 3. Why does this stuff matter? When we draw a correlation between length and quality, we are also inherently factoring in price. A lot of people actually responded to that Inescapable video saying it wouldn't have been that bad if it hadn't cost $50. US, at least. If it had been $20, people might have been a lot more charitable to it. Likewise, if it hadn't been so egregiously long, I probably wouldn't have hated it as much. The tedium of that experience just dragging on for fucking ever was a huge part of why it was so bad. Even if the exact same game existed with the same characters and arcs, but it managed to shrink down to 20 hours to complete all 4 routes, it would have been a lot more tolerable. It would have still had functionally all the same narrative flaws as before, just without wasting literal days of my life trying to play through it all. I think the interpretation of this stuff as a correlation between length, quality, and cost is honestly maybe even a bit mistaken. Rather, it's typically a balancing act. Ideally, you want quality, length, and cost to all be in line with one another. And this gets into what I mentioned earlier about how pricing in the US in particular lines up with how we interpret length. 20 hours for a $20 video game sounds like a fair deal to a lot of people. $60 for a 60-hour game sounds like a good deal for the same reason, $1 per hour. Pricing in the middle of those two is a little bit awkward and tends to be reserved for games that are just kind of not as important, or at least not if they're AAA. $30, $40, $50 are all kind of wonky price points because $30 feels like an expensive $20 and $50 feels like a suspiciously cheap $60 or an overpriced $40. And $40, well, that's where the AA space would probably go if it was allowed to exist. Alternatively, it's where games like Overwatch used to sit. Big AAA games where you were functionally getting a discount on the initial price with the expectation you'd probably make up for it in loot boxes. Indie games are small games, and small games should cost $20 because they're short games, or less. And short games are, themselves, 20 hours or less, even if they're not. AAA games are big games, which means they need to be good, long, and appropriately priced. The game should be $60 if it's 60 hours or more, because as long as it's over 60 hours, it tends to be lumped in together as just 60. And, it should be that long because that is a long game. And this does actually create some actual bookends for gaming. If you're making a small indie game, even if you put thousands and thousands of hours of work into it, and it is largely received as one of the best, most influential, most important games of the decade, something with the cultural impact of Undertale or something, you'd still have to play by these rules. An indie game charging $60 feels like someone stepping out of their place, whereas a AAA game charging $20 feels almost suspicious. They must be doing some weird, gross shit with the monetization there. A free AAA game will have microtransactions too, obviously, but you kind of go into that knowing that. Whereas if they're charging $20 as a major studio, people will just probably assume that they're trying to gouge them for every last penny. Undertale's balance here is massively out of whack. Its price versus length and quality are all over the place relative to where it stands. Inescapable has the reverse problem. It's long enough to justify the price in theory, but in practice it's too bad to be that expensive even if it is that long. Overwatch being free means you don't have a price metric to compare it to, meaning that, in theory, you're getting a bargain on both length and price as they relate to quality. And this isn't just annoying because it means that it feels like companies are playing tricks on us, but because it changes the kind of games that get made and how they're made, especially as prices are increasing. I think part of why everyone's so mad at the jump from 60 USD to 80 USD for games is that $60 is the benchmark for not only a high quality game, but a long game as well. The very best of the best were up there charging $60, a lot of bad games were also charging $60, but that was kind of the threshold. That was the ceiling. That's what people internalized as the price to play the very best games. Bumping that up to $80 feels kind of egregious. Even if it were 100% down to inflation, which it isn't really. And so developers and studios are needing to find ways to justify that price. They can't just say it's $20 better because there isn't really a metric for $20 better in terms of the quality of storytelling. $60 was the ceiling for the best of the best for around 20 years. So now you're saying that we have to accept that every new game is suddenly $20 better than the best of the best? Like, by itself, that'll never fly. Instead, we have to look at metrics that we can increase. Stuff like length. Make the games longer, we stretch them out more, we give the gamers $80 worth of hours of gaming by making it just stupidly long. We create a new tier in people's minds. Instead of everything that's 60 plus hours long being lumped together, now we have to create the 80-hour plus tier that's for really long and really good games. The reason it's a problem is that this typically means artificially inflating the length of the game, adding in extra fluff or wasting more time or whatever else to try and hit these arbitrary quotas so the game can be advertised on the basis of, yes, this costs $80, which is officially too much, but it comes with too many hours as well. It's extra expensive because it's extra long, and that's basically the same thing as it being extra good. And this doesn't really happen in any other medium like this. When songs went from 99 cents on iTunes to $1.29, nobody felt owed an extra 30 cents worth of music. And nobody felt compelled to give an extra 30 cents worth of music to the listener either. As movie ticket prices have gone up, movies haven't gotten longer to try and justify that price. As streaming services, cable providers, and satellite providers have charged more, they haven't been producing longer episodes and seasons of better TV shows. Arguably, in the case of some, like Netflix, they've done the opposite. Again, we don't treat quality, length, and cost as being so intrinsically related in other media. It's video games specifically that seem to face this unique pressure, and in part, it's because it's been so uniquely unrestrained as a medium on this front for just most of its entire existence. And in theory, this isn't an inherently bad thing all the time. We get bigger and more expansive games if the system is working as intended. But in practice, these arbitrary thresholds water down games and make them worse. And that's not even to talk about the labor conditions. If a game needs to just keep getting longer, it means that either the games take longer to come out, which a lot of publishers probably aren't going to want to do. So instead you get the alternative, which is that they crunch people more. Putting all of this bluntly, having an infinite number of boring things to do is worse than having a finite number of fun things to do. And yet games will continue trying to do it more and more as they feel the pressure to justify that $80 price tag. A big part of the push for generative AI in gaming right now is being made using this exact aspect of the medium as a defense, that generative AI can create infinite, evolving content. But this exposes the problem with this mentality because the AI cannot generate good content, even if it can generate it indefinitely. If your only metric by which you evaluate games is how many hours you can sink into it, or even if that's just your primary one, and that is the only or primary metric we can use to determine whether or not we should buy a game because we can't really use it's really good as some objective factor the way we can with it's 100 hours, generative AI is the final stage of evolution for the medium. But if you care at all about quality, about art, about human expression, or even just about someone respecting your time enough to actually craft something for you instead of letting ChatGPT babysit you in Skyrim, then this is worthless. In fact, it's less than worthless because it crowds out quality content by drowning it in the slop that panders to the lowest common denominator and makes it harder to find good games. And that's not just a problem for the consumer, but for producers as well. There are a finite number of dollars that can be spent by any given consumer in the year, and every one that gets peeled off by AI slop means fewer dollars that actual real human developers who are good at what they do can use to stay afloat. And on top of that, investors will stop spending that money on them. After all, if it costs so much more money to produce a game with human labor, but it still sells for the same $80, then why not just throw it at some slop? You can produce a lot of slop with a few dollars. A long game isn't inherently a good game, or inherently a bad game. But I think if this medium is to survive and thrive and reach the heights that I think it can, then we need to be able to decouple length, quality, and price from one another when it comes to critiquing and evaluating this medium. There are extremely good games that are really short, and even more games that are good but could have been great if they were just a bit shorter and more focused. And I can already hear the comments saying that the same could go for this video. Oh well. And that's where this video is going to end. If you've enjoyed this one, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. The next video is actually going to be 2 videos in a double feature, with The 100 Line is my game of the year, but I can't tell you why, coming out on February 28th, and How to Rig a Vote and Get Away with It coming out the day after on March 1st. As well, the February Members' Choice Poll concluded on February 10th, with Oblivion, Skyrim, and How Limitations Can Make Games Better finally winning after its 6th at bat. I'm also making a rare exception to my own rules and pulling the How Sombra Ruined Overwatch's Story topic out of the lineup. Given the massive change up in Overwatch's story that happened after this topic was introduced, it wouldn't make sense to just leave the topic in there as is. And since I want to talk about it even more now, I'm just going to make it myself instead of having it come back in the April poll like it was supposed to. Instead, I'm going to replace it with the old video topic, Drag Race and the Death of Competition, which was the second most popular topic in the community poll I did a while back about resurrecting an old one. Hopefully this is an understandable decision given the unique circumstances, but if not, I apologize. Anyways, Oblivion, Skyrim, and How Limitations Can Make Games Better will be coming out on March 15th, followed by Why Do Games Hate to Tell You How to Play Them coming out on March 29th. There will also be a new Members' Choice poll starting on March 1st, and the topics for that will be why social skills actually matter in competitions. This video will explore how social skills work as both offensive and defensive tools in competitive environments, and why that's important. Why realistic graphics are never quite right. This video would be about the problem with realistic graphics, both in terms of why it's a boring artistic decision in my opinion, as well as why it's always just a little bit wrong. The relatability of flopping. This video would explore how a flop era isn't always the worst thing in the world, how it humanizes people we sometimes see as larger than life figures and reminds us that they are human. Mizuki's a good character you people just can't read. This video would be a defense of Mizuki Kawano from an audience of Overwatch players who seem determined to mischaracterize and misunderstand him at every turn, and would explore the difference between a badly written character versus a character you just don't like. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members, including all current members plus all the members from when this video was chosen. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Rowa Juice, and Bingo Banga. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Enchitenar, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, NJD, and Mooney. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavoss, Crimson Cyclo, CatLover192, Corey, MB, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku_, Safon, Lala the Bambi, Teo Tamara, Puddinsis, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Ismi, Aiden S, 1000 Dumplings, Neelost, Prism, Lily Hero, Mitzicore, Bubble Boy, and Shy J. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just somebody who decided to click on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.